There are moments in live television that deserve far more attention than they receive. Moments where the conventional narrative runs headlong into a single, well-placed question, and the entire premise of the conversation quietly collapses under its own weight. One of those moments happened recently. An anchor, speaking to millions of viewers in real time, delivered what she clearly considered a definitive verdict on XRP. She said it plainly, without qualification. The only real use for XRP, she stated, is speculation. The man seated across from her did not bristle. He did not interrupt. He did not launch into a prepared defense. He simply held his composure, leaned in with the measured confidence of someone who has spent decades analyzing risk for a living, and responded with a question of his own. He asked, calmly and precisely, which asset is actually carrying more risk at this moment, XRP or Tesla stock? Most viewers, shaped by years of conventional financial messaging, would fire off an answer without pausing. But the correct answer, the one grounded in actual recent market data, does something quite remarkable. It systematically dismantles the assumptions most people hold about what the word safe genuinely means in modern investing. That is what we are unpacking today. The exchange, the question, the evidence behind it, and the broader institutional story that runs directly underneath all of it. As always, an important note before we begin. Nothing presented in this video constitutes financial advice of any kind. This is analytical commentary shared openly so you can apply your own judgment. All investment decisions carry risk, and every conclusion you reach should be your own. Before examining what was said, it is worth understanding clearly who said it, because the source of an argument carries weight in proportion to the speaker's actual experience with risk and capital. The guest in that exchange was Sal Gilbertie, the chief executive officer of Teucrium, the investment management firm responsible for one of the first XRP-focused funds to gain approval and begin trading in the United States. His credentials in the financial markets are not built on cryptocurrency advocacy or digital asset speculation. Sal Gilbertie built his professional foundation in commodities trading, corn, soybeans. The most tangible, unglamorous, and fundamentally supply and demand-driven asset categories that financial markets offer. Decades of professional experience navigating the least fashionable but most disciplined corners of the investment world. That background is not a minor detail. The analytical discipline required to succeed in commodity markets over a long career is built almost entirely on separating economic fundamentals from market noise, maintaining positions through volatility, and resisting the pull of trending narratives in favor of what the underlying data actually supports. When an investor shaped by that environment surveys the full landscape of digital assets and concludes that XRP deserves serious institutional consideration, the conclusion carries a different quality of weight than enthusiasm from a crypto advocate. People who have spent careers trading corn do not chase trending stories. They follow demonstrated utility and structural positioning. When the anchor introduced the speculation framing, Sal's response was architectural rather than defensive. He described what Ripple has actually engineered from the ground up, and where that engineering is now leading at an institutional scale. His description began with the foundational premise. Ripple was originally constructed to solve a specific, well-defined problem. Moving monetary value across international borders quickly and inexpensively, a problem that existing banking infrastructure handles in a manner that is slow, opaque, and disproportionately costly. That foundational capability is documented and functional. But in Sal's telling, what Ripple built as its starting point is now evolving into something considerably more consequential. A comprehensive framework for tokenizing real-world assets and for constructing the bridge that brings the established infrastructure of traditional finance into direct operational contact with the emerging infrastructure of blockchain-based digital finance. To support that thesis, he pointed to a corporate transaction that most mainstream financial coverage treated as a footnote. Ripple's acquisition of a broker-dealer and clearing firm. Understanding why that acquisition is significant requires a brief orientation on what a clearing firm actually does in the institutional financial system. A clearing firm sits at the resolution point of financial transactions. It is the entity that makes a trade final and legally complete, ensuring that obligations between counterparties are properly settled. When Ripple acquired that capability, it was not expanding its technology platform or its marketing footprint. It was purchasing direct operational participation in the part of the financial system where institutional transactions actually conclude. Sal described this as a foundational initial step in the process of weaving old-world financial infrastructure together with new-world digital rails. And then he offered an observation that I think deserves to be examined carefully rather than passed over quickly. He characterized this as a genuine breakthrough, but he added with unmistakable intentionality that it will develop on a timeline that is slower than most market participants currently anticipate or hope for. That specific framing, patience as a deliberate strategic posture rather than reluctant waiting, is not the language of speculative enthusiasm. It is the language of a long-horizon institutional investor who has watched cycles play out over decades and learned that the most durable returns tend to belong to those who outlast rather than outguess the market. Meaningful claims require meaningful evidence. So let us turn from the qualitative argument to the quantitative one, because the question Sal posed about relative risk was not rhetorical ornamentation. It was a precisely targeted challenge to a deeply embedded assumption, and the data behind it is striking. There is a cognitive framework that most investors absorbed long before they made their first trade. Equities, particularly the shares of large, established, widely followed companies, are the responsible and measured choice. Cryptocurrency is the speculative and volatile alternative. One belongs in a serious, grown-up portfolio. The other belongs in the category of high-risk bets made by those willing to gamble. This framing is so thoroughly embedded in mainstream financial culture that most people accept it without subjecting it to empirical scrutiny. Sal subjected it to empirical scrutiny. He directed attention to a specific 3-month period during which XRP demonstrated relative price consolidation, holding its valuation within a reasonable range through a period of broader market turbulence. During that exact same 3-month stretch, Tesla stock, one of the most prominently held, most enthusiastically discussed, and most widely recommended equity positions in the entire public market, surrendered approximately 50% of its value. Half. Gone in the span of a single quarter. The implication is not subtle. During that measurement window, the asset that financial media consistently labels as reckless speculation demonstrated relative stability. The asset that financial media consistently positions as the mature, responsible choice lost half its market value. Which category carries more risk? The answer that emerges from the data contradicts the answer that cultural conditioning suggests. Sal was deliberate in clarifying the boundaries of that argument. He was not asserting that XRP is immune to drawdowns. It is not, and no intellectually honest analyst would claim otherwise. His argument operated at a deeper level. Risk is not an intuitive feeling generated by an asset's association with novelty or unfamiliarity. Risk is a measurable quantity that should be evaluated through the lens of actual price behavior, volatility data, and fundamental positioning. The category labels that markets inherit from cultural convention do not always survive contact with the underlying mathematics. In this particular comparison, during this particular period, they did not. He also offered a demand signal that speaks directly to the scale of unmet appetite in the XRP market. There are currently more than 6 million individual XRP wallet addresses in existence, representing a substantial established user base. When Teucrium launched its leveraged XRP fund in the United States, the product generated significant trading volume within its very first days of availability. That is not the market behavior of a niche instrument attracting a small community of enthusiasts. That is the pattern of compressed, long-standing demand finding an accessible and familiar vehicle through which to finally express itself within a regulated framework. One point requires direct and emphatic emphasis here, one that Sal himself raised without hesitation. The Teucrium Fund employs leverage in its structure. Leveraged financial products are sophisticated instruments purpose-built for short-duration use by experienced traders who possess a thorough understanding of how leverage amplifies both gains and losses. They are not designed as long-term passive holding vehicles, and they are not appropriate entry points for investors who have not studied the specific mechanics of leveraged exposure carefully. If you are considering any leveraged product in this space, the prerequisite is thorough independent research, not enthusiasm about an underlying asset's prospects. There is a question that sits directly beneath the surface of everything we have covered so far, and it deserves a candid and honest answer rather than a deflection. If the structural case for XRP is as coherent as the data suggests, and if the institutional interest is as substantive as the facts indicate, then why did the asset spend years trapped behind regulatory walls, legal uncertainty, and institutional avoidance? Why the lawsuit? Why the extended period of stasis? Why did the door remain closed for so long? Sal addressed this directly on camera, and his framing was notably measured and fair-minded rather than emotionally charged. He identified the obstruction with clinical precision. For years, a regulated institutional product like the one Teucrium eventually brought to market was structurally impossible to launch. The reason was not technological deficiency. The XRP Ledger's capabilities were not the limiting factor. The reason was not the absence of investor demand. The demand, as the fund's initial trading volume demonstrated, was clearly present and waiting. The reason was regulatory leadership. Specifically, the posture of the SEC under former Chairman Gary Gensler, combined with the operational uncertainty created by the agency's extended lawsuit against Ripple, functioned as a hard ceiling that prevented institutional product development from moving forward. What followed in Sal's account is the part I found most notable, not for its drama, but for its absence of drama. Rather than framing this history as a story of institutional malice or deliberate suppression, Sal drew a careful distinction between the regulatory agency's leadership and its professional staff. He characterized the working professionals at the SEC as knowledgeable, rigorous, and genuinely responsive to well-constructed legal and technical arguments. He described them as people who push back when the argument is insufficient and who accept well-reasoned positions when the evidence supports them. The problem, in his framing, was never the institutional staff executing policy. It was the directional priorities set by the leadership at the top of the agency. When that leadership changed, when Paul Atkins succeeded Gary Gensler as SEC chairman, the transformation did not require a legal battle or a dramatic regulatory reversal. The door did not need to be forced open. It simply became possible again to engage the regulatory process in good faith, follow the established application procedures, and receive a review that evaluated the merits of the proposal on its actual qualities. Teucrium did exactly that. The firm applied as soon as the regulatory environment made application viable. The process ran its course. The fund listed. No drama. No confrontation. A wall that had existed for years quietly ceased to exist. The implications of that story are worth sitting with carefully. If the primary barrier to XRP's institutional accessibility was not the asset's technology, not its utility, and not its fundamental demand base, but rather the directional priorities of leadership at a single regulatory agency, then the removal of that leadership does not represent a minor adjustment to the landscape. It represents a structural change in the operating environment, and structural changes tend to have structural consequences. Everything we have examined so far speaks to one fund, one regulatory agency, and one company's strategic moves. But the next layer of this story expands the aperture considerably, because while public debate about XRP's merit consumed the foreground of the narrative, The actual operational infrastructure of institutional finance was being quietly rewired in the background. Banks, federal regulators, and settlement infrastructure providers were not waiting for the public debate to resolve. They were building. Start with the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. This agency operates outside the high-profile regulatory spotlight that the SEC typically commands, but its jurisdiction over national banks gives it enormous practical authority over what American financial institutions are operationally permitted to do. The OCC recently issued a formal guidance clarification stating, in direct and accessible language, that national banks are now authorized to provide digital asset custody services, to hold the reserve assets that back stablecoin instruments, and to use distributed ledger technology and stablecoins as functional tools for payment processing and settlement operations. The communication was delivered without ceremony, in the understated language of regulatory policy. But the operational permissions it extended represent a meaningful expansion of what American banking institutions can build and offer in the digital asset space. The OCC also contextualized that guidance by noting that more than 50 million Americans currently hold cryptocurrency in some form. The framing was explicit. This is no longer a marginal or peripheral phenomenon being tentatively accommodated. It is already a mainstream reality that regulatory frameworks need to address directly and constructively. The next layer of evidence comes from within the European banking system. Societe Generale, one of the most systemically significant financial institutions in Europe by any measure of asset scale or operational reach, has built a dedicated digital asset division operating under the name SG Forge. Through SG Forge, the bank issued its own euro-denominated stablecoin. In a public presentation, SG Forge representative Tom Sullivan described the instrument's deployment trajectory. The stablecoin launched on a single blockchain network and has since been expanded across multiple additional networks as the operational requirements of the use cases it serves became clearer. Among the networks explicitly named in that expansion is the XRP Ledger. Sullivan did not present this as a theoretical capability or a future roadmap item. During a live demonstration, two counterparties engaged in an actual collateral movement exercise on a shared distributed ledger. One party initiated the transaction. The other party observed the ledger reflect the update almost simultaneously. Real collateral, real settlement, measured in seconds rather than the days of reconciliation work that the traditional back-office process for the same transaction would have required. Exposure covered. Counterparty risk resolved. The contrast with legacy settlement timelines was not incremental. It was categorical. Layer on top of that the activity at the DTCC, the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. The DTCC processes and settles the overwhelming majority of securities transactions in the American financial system. It is not peripheral infrastructure. It is the central settlement mechanism through which American capital markets actually function. The DTCC conducted a tokenization pilot program, referred to internally as the Great Experiment, which demonstrated the practical application of stablecoins moving on blockchain networks to improve the speed and capital efficiency of collateral management processes. In the documentation of that pilot, the DTCC identified the specific blockchain networks involved in the work. Ripple's network was explicitly named on that list, alongside Stellar's, Ethereum, and Solana. Examine that sequence as a connected chain rather than as isolated events. The primary federal regulator of national banks formally authorizes digital asset operational activity. A major European bank demonstrates live, real asset settlement on the XRP Ledger measured in seconds. The Central Settlement Institution of American Capital Markets runs a working pilot that names Ripple's infrastructure by name. The regulator opened the door. The bank walked through it. The settlement giant documented the process. Sal offered one additional observation that completes the structural picture. His expectation is that banks navigating the build-out of their digital asset capabilities will increasingly choose to engage established specialist infrastructure providers like Ripple rather than attempting to construct proprietary systems internally. His reasoning is grounded in institutional risk management logic rather than technology preference. When a bank builds its own blockchain infrastructure and something goes wrong, the operational failure, the reputational damage, and the regulatory exposure all attach to the bank's name directly. When a bank partners with a specialist provider that has demonstrated operational competence and bears its own reputational accountability for system performance, the bank has effectively transferred a significant portion of that operational risk to the specialist. In the language of institutional finance, that is called de-risking. And in environments where decision-makers are evaluated as much on stability and risk management as on performance metrics, the de-risked option tends to win the internal allocation decision. Let us step back now and look at the complete picture from the widest available perspective, because there is a single data point that crystallizes the gap between the loud version of this story and the quiet operational reality running underneath it. In one unremarkable 5-minute window on the XRP Ledger, tens of millions of dollars in value moved through the network, not triggered by a news event, not correlated with a price announcement, just the routine operational throughput of infrastructure doing what it was designed to do, processing value transfers quietly, efficiently, and without ceremony. No financial media outlet ran a breaking news segment about it. No anchor opened a broadcast with that figure. And the absence of coverage is itself the most telling part of the story. Two narratives are running simultaneously, and they are not in the same location. The loud narrative runs on the surfaces where attention is concentrated, where anchors deliver verdicts about speculation and audiences absorb those verdicts as established truth. The quiet narrative runs in the operational infrastructure, where European banks settle real collateral in seconds on distributed ledgers, where the OCC formally extends banking permissions to digital asset activities, where the DTCC names specific blockchain networks in its settlement pilots, and where tens of millions of dollars move across the XRP Ledger in 5-minute windows that nobody is reporting on. The deeper strategic picture that Sal Gilbertie and others operating at the serious institutional level are focused on is not about identifying the next price catalyst or timing a position around a specific announcement. It is about recognizing a structural shift in how the world will organize the movement and settlement of value. The trajectory, in his reading, points toward a future in which money, bonds, collateral, and eventually most forms of financial value are tokenized and settled on fast, programmable, blockchain-based infrastructure. The analogy he offered is one that I think should be taken seriously by anyone assessing the long-term opportunity here. The investors who captured the most significant returns from the development of the commercial Internet in the 1990s did not do so primarily by correctly predicting which specific companies would eventually dominate the landscape. They did so by recognizing, earlier than most, that the underlying infrastructure being built was going to fundamentally reorganize how commerce, communication, and information exchange operated. The infrastructure itself was the insight. The specific applications built on top of it followed from that recognition. Sal's read is that XRP keeps appearing in exactly the places where today's equivalent infrastructure is taking shape. Not in the promotional materials of cryptocurrency advocates, in the live demonstrations of European banks, in the working pilots of American settlement institutions, in the formal guidance of federal banking regulators, not as a speculative instrument, as operational rail. Let us close by returning to where we started and assembling everything we have covered into a single coherent picture. A commodities professional with decades of Wall Street experience sat across from a television anchor, declined to be rattled by dismissive characterization, and redirected the entire conversation with a single disciplined question about measured risk. The data behind that question showed that over a 3-month period, XRP demonstrated relative price stability while Tesla stock lost approximately half its value. 6 million XRP wallets exist. A regulated leveraged fund generated significant volume in its first days of trading. Ripple acquired a broker-dealer and clearing firm to establish direct participation in institutional settlement. Sal characterized this as a genuine breakthrough developing on a patient, long-horizon timeline. The regulatory wall that blocked institutional product development for years was not a technology problem. It was a leadership posture problem. Specifically, the environment created under former SEC Chair Gary Gensler and the shadow of the Ripple lawsuit. When SEC Chair Paul Atkins came in and the operational environment normalized, Teucrium followed standard procedures, applied for approval, and listed. The wall was there 1 year and gone the next. The working staff at the SEC, in Sal's telling, had the knowledge and professional integrity throughout. The variable was leadership orientation at the top. The OCC formally authorized national banks to custody digital assets, hold stablecoin reserves, and use distributed ledgers for payment settlement, noting that more than 50 million Americans already hold cryptocurrency. Societe Generale's digital division SG Forge, through Representative Tom Sullivan, described its euro stablecoin expanding across multiple blockchain networks including the XRP Ledger, and demonstrated live collateral settlement in seconds on a shared distributed ledger. The DTCC's Great Experiment tokenization pilot named Ripple's network explicitly alongside Stellar, Ethereum, and Solana. Banks are expected to lean on specialist infrastructure providers like Ripple to de-risk their digital asset operations, and in any given 5-minute window, tens of millions of dollars move across the XRP ledger without a single news headline acknowledging it. The fear in this market is loud. The speculation label gets attached with confidence by voices that command large audiences. But the operational activity underneath the noise is not speculative. It is structural. And structural developments tend to assert themselves on their own schedule, independent of whether the loudest voices in the room have caught up yet. The fear is consistently at its most intense in the window, just before the quiet story becomes obvious to the broader audience. I have no interest in chasing price candles or reacting to short-term sentiment swings. The quiet screen, the one showing bank demonstrations and regulatory guidance and settlement pilots and real throughput numbers, is where the durable story is being written. That is where my attention stays. One question for you as you process all of this. Do you believe the speculation label currently attached to XRP in mainstream financial media is still going to be the dominant framing 2 years from now? Or has the fundamental nature of the asset's institutional positioning already changed, and the label is simply lagging behind the reality? Share your honest assessment in the comments. Every response gets read, and the perspectives from this community consistently sharpen the analysis. Keep your analytical framework grounded in facts. Keep your time horizon appropriately long. Keep your awareness of risk honest and proportionate. The story unfolding here has always been larger than any individual price movement, and it will continue to develop on its own patient timeline. A final reminder, as always. Everything you heard today is analysis and perspective, not financial advice. It never has been and never will be on this channel. Do your own thorough research, protect your own capital, and take care of your own financial well-being first.